Lecture 18, What is Consciousness? In particular, is it an entirely physical phenomenon? So last time we saw an argument for Cartesian dualism, the view, as Descartes puts it, that I am simply a thinking, non-extended thing, really distinct from my body. This time we're going to look at an argument not for the conclusion that we are non-physical or immaterial things, but for the conclusion that consciousness is not wholly physical or material. That argument is called the knowledge argument, and it's in this classic paper that you read by the Australian philosopher Frank Jackson called Epiphenomenal Qualia. So in that paper, Jackson argues that physicalism is false, specifically because, as he says, the characteristic experiences of tasting a lemon, smelling a rose, seeing a tomato, and so on, are not entirely physical. In other words, consciousness, or as philosophers say, phenomenal consciousness, is not entirely physical. For an explanation of this terminology and distinctions between different kinds of consciousness, see pages 352 to 3 of the Norton Anthology. Before looking at Jackson's argument, we need a more precise statement of physicalism, the view that the world is, in some sense, to be made precise, wholly physical or material. One version is in the Reader's Guide to Epiphenomenal Qualia. Let's have another one. First, I need to introduce a bit of philosophical jargon. Possible worlds. A possible world is a maximally specific, maximally detailed way things could have been. You can think of a possible world as an alternative universe. To borrow a theological metaphor, it's a universe that God could have created. So it is in fact sunny today, but it could have rained. It didn't rain, but it could have. In the jargon of possible worlds, there is a possible world in which it rains today. No one has squared the circle, and this is no accident. No one could have squared the circle. Squaring the circle is impossible. In the jargon of possible worlds, there is no possible world in which someone squares the circle. Out of all the maximally specific ways things could have been, out of all of the alternative possible universes, there is one that corresponds to the way things actually are, to the universe as we know and love it. That is called the actual world. The actual world is the maximally specific way things are. In other words, it's the totality of truths or facts. The actual world is a possible world too, because whatever is actually the case is also possibly the case. Okay, that's possible worlds. For more explanation, see the glossary in the Norton Anthology. I hope that's clear enough to be going on with. Now, with that bit of jargon under our belts, let's get on to the statement of physicalism. Here it is. Any possible world that is physically the same as the actual world is exactly alike it in all respects. Equivalently, any possible world that is physically the same as the actual world just is the actual world. This is a slightly simplified statement of physicalism, but the simplification won't matter for our purposes. In particular, if physicalism is true, there are no zombie worlds. This statement of physicalism is an example of a supervenience thesis. You can look up supervenience in the glossary. Now, what do I mean by zombie world? Here is the actual world, the way things are, and it's got a bunch of people in it, of course, including Kelly and Thomas, and they are both conscious. And here is what you might think is a possible world, an alternative universe, a maximally specific way things could have been. It's physically exactly the same as the actual world, a molecule for molecule, quark for quark replica of the actual world. W1 is physically just the same as the actual world, and we can take that to mean that from the point of view of some hypothetical complete physics, W1 and the actual world are alike. A hypothetical complete physics can't distinguish between them. Okay, so I've told you a fair bit about W1, but I haven't told you everything. Here's another piece of information about W1. In it, Kelly and Thomas are not conscious. Kelly, of course, is still tasting a lemon, and Thomas is still smelling a rose, but all is dark within. There is nothing it's like to be Kelly or Thomas in W1. They are not phenomenally conscious. Okay, now you might think that W1 is a genuine way the world could have been. It's not the actual world, but it is a possible world. There are zombie possible worlds, in other words. However, according to the physicalist, that is wrong. There is no such possible world as W1. There are no zombie worlds. That's because, according to the physicalist, once the physical facts are in place, this fixes all the facts. No wiggle room is left for any other facts to vary. Let's have another example to see more clearly what is going on. Let hairism be the view that any possible world exactly like our world in its distribution of hairs on people's heads is exactly like it in its distribution of what I'll call hirsute people. An hirsute person is simply someone who is not bald. Okay, so according to the hairist, there are no baldy worlds. This is the analogue of zombie worlds. So here's the actual world. Here are Kelly and Thomas. They are both hirsute. Is there a possible world, call it W2, which is a hair-for-hair replica of the actual world, but in which Kelly and Thomas are both bald, despite having the very same distribution of hairs on their heads as they have in the actual world? Well, the hairist says no. There is no such possible world as W2. Once you've fixed the facts about the distribution of hairs on people's heads, then you fix the facts about who's bald and who is hirsute. Hairism is very plausible. Physicalism is like hairism in being a supervenience thesis, but it is by no means as obvious as hairism. And of course, Jackson is going to argue that it's false. So in Epiphenomenal Qualia, Jackson describes physicalism as the thesis that all correct information is physical information. See the Reader's Guide for a bit more on this. But I think it's a lot easier to understand physicalism in the way I just explained it as a supervenience thesis. And Jackson is certainly arguing against physicalism as I just explained it. Note that we could put physicalism using the terminology of entailment. It's the view that the totality of physical facts entails, that is, logically implies, all the facts. Once the physical facts are in place, everything else follows. There is no room for anything else to vary. We're going to make use of this formulation in a moment. Now, you could argue against physicalism by simply appealing to the premise that zombie worlds are possible. After all, consciousness can seem like a spectral inner flame that could be extinguished without changing anything physical, in particular without changing anything physical in the brain. Jackson calls that kind of argument against physicalism the modal argument. He does not think it's effective for reasons he gives in section 2. His goal is to give a superior argument against physicalism, the knowledge argument. Jackson has a couple of fictional characters in Epiphenomenal Qualia. One is Fred, who has better colour vision than anyone else on record. He has most of the airtime, but in fact it's his co-star Mary who completely overshadows him in the subsequent literature and who captured the philosophical imagination. Mary has normal colour vision, but she's never seen any chromatic colours. She's only seen black, white, and shades of grey. She's a brilliant scientist, forced to investigate the world from a black and white room via a black and white television monitor. She acquires, let us suppose, all the physical information there is to obtain about what goes on when we see ripe tomatoes, use terms like red, and so on. She knows everything physical there is to know about optics, wavelengths of light, how light is reflected off tomatoes, how photoreceptors work, and so on. What will happen, Jackson asks, when Mary is released from her black and white room? In particular, will she learn anything or not? One possibility is that she won't learn anything at all.
Ah, nothing to see here. That's exactly as I expected.
But there is another possibility.
Strange. Good grief, I never knew seeing red would be like this.
And Jackson goes for the second option. It just seems obvious that she will learn something about the world and our experience of it. But she had all the physical information when inside her black and white room. Ergo, therefore, physicalism is false. Turning now to Patricia Churchland's paper, Are Mental States Irreducible to Neurobiological States? She is not convinced by the knowledge argument. She criticizes her version of the knowledge argument, that is, the knowledge argument that she ascribes to Jackson. It's not the same as the one that I will set out in a minute, but some of her criticisms also apply to that version. Emotions, I should say, among philosophers do tend to run high on this subject. The whole issue of materialism versus dualism. Philip Goff is a philosopher who works at the University of Durham in the UK, And he just wrote a book defending panpsychism, the view that, as he explains it in this article that I am linking to, the smallest bits of matter, things such as electrons and quarks, have very basic kinds of experience. An electron has an inner life. So on this view, according to panpsychism, consciousness is a much, much more widespread phenomenon than you might have initially thought. Anyway, the other day, Goff tweeted, "The data of neuroscience is neutral between materialism, dualism, and panpsychism. Anyone with a theory of consciousness is doing metaphysics. It's just that some of us are able to admit it." Patricia Churchland did not like this at all. She first said, "This is probably the stupidest thing I've ever read. Amazing what philosophers can convince themselves of. Is physics also neutral between these things?" And then followed it up with, "What about pixie dust, leprechauns, ghosts?" Anyway, here's the knowledge argument according to Churchland. Premise 1. Mary knows everything there is to know about brain states and their properties. Premise 2. It is not the case that Mary knows everything there is to know about sensations and their properties. Conclusion. Sensations and their properties are not the same thing as brain states and their properties. A couple of questions for you. First, is this a good way of setting out the knowledge argument? Second question, is this a good argument? Here's another version, which I prefer. See also the Reader's Guide. First premise, before her release from her black and white room, Mary knows all the physical facts, or at any rate, all the physical facts relevant to conscious experience of colours. From that premise, we first derive the conclusion C1. If physicalism is true, pre-release Mary knows all the facts. Or, at any rate, she could know all the facts if she just did a bit of logical reasoning. Now we have C1. Here's another premise, P2. Post-release Mary learns a fact, something she couldn't have known while imprisoned in her black and white room. Okay, so we've got C1. If physicalism is true, pre-release Mary knows all the facts. P2, post-release Mary learns something she couldn't have known before her release, from which it follows that physicalism is false. What about the step from P1 to C1? Why is that plausible? Why does it follow that if pre-release Mary knows all the facts, then if physicalism is true, pre-release Mary knows everything? Here is some motivation for the move from P1 to C1. Remember that if physicalism is true, then the physical facts entail, that is, logically imply, all the facts. Mary is, we may suppose, in addition to being a brilliant colour scientist, also a super logician. So what could stop her, if physicalism is true, from knowing all the facts? She can just deduce them from her physical knowledge. So if we grant the move from P1 to C1, then we've got three options. First, deny the first premise, P1. Maybe for some reason, Mary's impoverished colour experiences when inside her black and white room prevent her from knowing all the physical facts. Second option, deny P2. Go for the first scenario, that Mary just says, hum ho, nothing to see here, when she's released from her black and white room. And the third option, the only one remaining, since we're granting the step from P1 to C1 and everything else is valid, is to embrace the conclusion. Physicalism is false. You may have been wondering about Mary's yellow head. Did she ever see it? The answer is no. Her jailers were careful to keep any mirror-like surfaces out of her monochromatic prison. Could such a simple argument really show something so profound about the nature of the universe? That's for you to figure out. We saw that philosophers have trouble keeping their emotions in check in the philosophy of mind. Fortunately, next week we're going to start a subject that everyone can dispassionately examine without getting overheated: race and gender. Read Appiah and Spencer for Monday. Appiah's paper has lots of interesting material about W.E.B. Du Bois, but you just need to concentrate on Appiah's argument that there are no races. I'll see you then.